Hello, my name is Morgan Barker, and for assignment 2, I did option number 3, which was the informational video. So I will be talking about a few topics that I found interesting throughout the course of forensic psychology and topics I would find interesting in explaining to people who haven't taken the course and how I would explain it to them. So here we go. Concept 1 is competence, and competence was covered in Chapter 8. So when a person is set to stand trial, the court must decide if they're competent enough to do so. So in Chapter 8, competence was defined as a person having the capability to participate and understand personal along with legal functions, so they're able to understand what's going on with themselves and within the court. And this is important when looking at a person's final verdict and if they're capable to defend themselves or not. And the court uses a list of different functional characteristics a person must uphold in order to be deemed competent in trial. So these are different characteristics a person has where the court will see that and see that they're able to defend themselves. So these some examples of these characteristics are being appropriate towards or during the trial and able to understand charges and just basically being able to understand what's going on. So a bit more on competence. Competence is important in a trial because the verdict of the trial relies a lot on the defendant and what they can bring to the table. And if the defendant is not competent, they will be unable to properly go through the trial, and this may alter the results. So it's important to know because it reflects how different each case can be and how each verdict can be different case to case, and how competence is not thought of a lot in regard of to how a defendant goes through court, and I think it's interesting to know that there's still a need for total understanding in order to go through an entire case as a defendant. So I just found it interesting that a person has to be deemed completely competent and able to defend themselves in court. So for concept 2, I have the probability of conviction, which is covered in chapter 12. And conviction happens when the court deems the defendant guilty, and Chapter 12 discusses the different characteristics and circumstances that might play a role in a person's probability of getting convicted. So whether a person's more likely to get convicted or less likely to get convicted regarding or in relevancy to what the characteristics that they hold. So some examples of characteristics that might raise the probability of someone being convicted are being part of a company, since companies are typically held to a higher standard in the court, and having repeated criminal acts on their record, etc. So qualities such as wealth, social status, etc. may also play a minimal role in a person's probability of conviction. So these are more like personal um, characteristics that a person may be born with or put into that they have less control over. And so these might have a minimal um, role in this as well. So a bit more about the probability of conviction. So looking at a person's probability of conviction is more important or is important because it reflects the differences of similar trials in regard to who the defendant is, and probability of conviction can also show us any inequalities that are amongst the court rulings. So anything that is deemed as a inequality, so if a person's more likely to get convicted than another person that's doing the same crime just because of other circumstances or characteristics that they uphold. And then this is also important because it helps the court understand a person's probability of committing a crime again, due to the probability of conviction increasing when it is a person that has committed crimes previously. So the last concept, concept number 3 that I'll be talking about is leniency bias, which this was also covered in chapter 12. And leniency bias is described in the chapter as the tendency for trials to be decided not guilty when there's a split decision amongst the jury. So when the jury comes to a 50-50 vote, So half the jury votes guilty, half the jury votes not guilty. The court will typically come to the decision that the defendant is not guilty. So the verdict is usually not guilty for these circumstances. And there has been questioning as to whether this tendency is fair or if there should be another standard put into place for these instances. So a bit more about leniency bias. So this is being implemented in the court makes sense in regard to America being the like innocent until proven guilty country. So if a person is not technically proven guilty in the court, so it's 50-50, then it makes sense that they would be the verdict would be non-guilty. While this is true, there could be instances of a guilty person being ruled not guilty and also a guilty person being or a non-guilty person being ruled guilty. So these instances may be rare, but knowing about this bias helps us see how different each verdict can be and how unsure the rulings can be sometimes. And this bias specifically made me wonder about the legitimacy of each court ruling and the ways that this can affect people's lives. So seeing this part of the chapter really made me question and think about how each court ruling may not be valid, may not be true, but it's just about what the jury says and the results that they show. So, in conclusion, forensic psychology explores topics that people outside of the forensic world might not know a lot about, and learning about these topics has informed me a lot about the different issues within the court systems, along with learning about the different standards that are set in place. And I found all of these very interesting, and knowing about these topics helped me understand the biases and the different processes that go into deciding a defendant's verdict, along with the repercussions that remain from these standards.